our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of Unspun. For our time together this week, I want to talk about local journalism. I want to talk about some of the stresses that are affecting local TV stations and what's left of local newspapers, about where we've been, kind of where we are, and maybe where we're going. And then a little bit about what you can do to help. But before we get into that, I'd like to talk a little bit about appeals to authority. We're seeing this a lot as we're hearing from the government, particularly about tariffs. So have a listen to this clip between CNN journalist Jake Tapper and Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins.
President Trump laid out with a giant graphic of all the countries where tariffs were going to be, what he called reciprocal tariffs were going to be imposed. And you're imposing a 10% tariff on the herd in McDonald Islands. The herd in McDonald Islands have zero human inhabitants. They have zero exports. They have zero imports. They do have a lot of penguins. Why are you putting import tariffs on islands that are entirely populated by penguins?
Well, I mean, come on, Jake. Obviously, here's the bottom line. We live under a tariff regime from other countries. We have too long
the McDonald Islands is not imposing
the idea that America goes first. I mean, come on. Whatever. Listen, the people that are leading this are serious, intentional, patriotic, the smartest people I've ever worked with. I did not come up with the formulas. I'm the ag secretary. I studied agriculture at Texas A&M. I was in a lot of conversations to make sure our farmers and our ranchers were part of that. The president recognized the importance of inputs. We got potash and fertilizer to make sure they could do their planting. But I have no doubt that I speak on behalf of President Trump when he would say he has the utmost confidence in the team and what they have built and what they have put together. And we are unleashing a new golden age, and we will see an economy that will benefit not just every corner of America, but our farmers and our ranchers and the people that have been left behind for far too long by both Republicans and Democrats.
In that clip, Jake Tapper is asking about tariffs, and in particular about why tariffs are being applied to uninhabited islands. And what did Rollins reply to him? She replied that it was basically a silly question and that she was very qualified to speak about agriculture because she had a degree in agriculture and served as Secretary of Agriculture. Now, it's great that the Secretary of Agriculture has a degree and experience, but in no way does that answer Jake Tapper's question. And this is an example of a media source not answering the question, but instead trying to drag the narrative over to what it is they want to talk about. In this case, it's also a bit of an appeal to authority, because Rollins is speaking about her education and experience is essentially making Tapper's question moot. Remember, an appeal to authority is where a newsmaker will say that because a particular source exists, the point is proven, and the connection isn't actually made. That's something you can maybe watch for as people are talking about the economic effects of the possible global trade war that's about to go on. Okay, let's get back to local journalism and let's get unspun. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the history of communication. So in particular, journalism used to be called the Fourth Estate. So why was it called that? The estates were essentially socially powerful elements. So those included the clergy, it included the politicians or the nobility, and it included the ordinary people. And so journalism, as the Fourth Estate, the fourth socially powerful force, had a couple of jobs. One of them was to actually represent the views of the nobility, let people know what it was that the people in power were doing. But the other was to represent the views of the people to the people in authority. And in doing both of those things, journalism had what we sometimes call a watchdog role, right? So their job was to keep authority in check by providing information on both sides. Journalism as a whole has been very affected by technology. And I think you can think of a first sort of bit of technology as maybe like the bell that a town crier would have had, right? Standing on the corner, hear ye, hear ye. And, even in some places today, they still will have announcements from noble people. So, for example, when the heir to the crown in Great Britain is born, someone might make an announcement in that way. But we've kind of moved on since that. And here in the New World, one of the first ways that we had journalism was through what we called daybooks. So you can think about at the time that we had colonization of North America from Europe, we didn't have instantaneous communication at that time, right? Because it was literally an ocean away and we didn't have telegraphs or anything like that. So instead, a big ship from the old world would pull up and it would anchor offshore, and little boats would go from the big ship to the shore. And on those little boats were sailors. And being sailors, one of the first places they went to was the pub. These sailors, they would go into the pub, and while they were enjoying whatever they did in the pub, they were also writing down the news from home in what they called daybooks. It's really wild to think about how that kind of word of mouth has been changed by technology today. So we went from daybooks to the kind of movable type that became possible in this country, Ben Franklin being one of the first people able to do that kind of printing. And that movable type let people print a pretty large volume of information relatively quickly. And we went from the movable type age to the digital and then the electronic ages, and now your news probably comes to you on your phone. And today, we're even asking machines to create it for us. So the way we get our news, the way that we know what's real, what matters, what we should care about, it's really never stood still. It's always been shaped by the tools of the time. And we don't always talk about how those tools are shaping us in return, because the news that you have is not just something that you consume, but it's something that consumes you. It influences how you see your neighbors and your country and your future. And I want to talk about a couple of major forces in news. The first one we've got to talk about is money, because news isn't free, and it really never has been. It's just that we've kind of stopped noticing who's paying the bill. I can say that at the time that I graduated from college and started working as a journalist, newspapers were a great investment. If you owned a local newspaper, you made a lot of money. And that's because people have always had a real need for information. And this was the only way that they were going to be able to get it. It wasn't just information like what the city council did this week, but it was also information like what's on sale at the grocery store, or what movies are playing, or even just who has died in town. All of those things are pieces of information that was really hard to get in any other way. So whoever controlled the access to that information, whether that was the publisher of your local newspaper, maybe the staff at your local TV station, they had the ability to essentially make quite a bit of money by charging people for access to that information. And in the late 90s, which is when I first started working in journalism, about 80% of the revenue that newspapers made came from advertising, mostly from classified ads. So for those of you who are not old enough to remember classified ads, there were a section that would show up and there were little squares, and the squares were fit into categories. Some of the categories that you might find would include lost and found. So if you found somebody's cat, you might pay and put a little advertisement in the newspaper. There were legal notices. This would be things like somebody's died. Does anyone want to put a claim on the estate of this dead person? That would be an example of a legal notice. One of the big ones was want ads. And I do remember actually looking for a job by getting a newspaper and looking in those little squares and trying to see if anybody was hiring someone who had my skills. So like I said, 80% of the revenue in newspapers came from advertising, and a lot of that advertising was classified, but not all of it. There were also display ads. So these were like your big inserts that would show up in the middle of the week and would say, what's on sale at this department store, or maybe the coupon inserts that you'd look for on the weekends. Other display advertising too, right? Like the car dealer might run a big ad for what was going to be for sale on the weekends. Interestingly, the size of an actual newspaper that came to your house was dependent pretty much entirely on the number of ads that were sold. So Wednesdays, when you had those circulars from the grocery store, thicker newspaper, more stuff in it. Sundays, when you had coupon inserts and things from car dealers and things like that, again, thicker newspaper, more stuff in it. And then along came something called Craigslist. Craigslist was launched in 1995, and it actually offered free classified ads online on the internet. And it was, separated city by city. So the service that a newspaper used to provide uniquely, the only way you could advertise that you had a job to a mass of people in a community was a newspaper, this was now available to many people and it was free. And by 2000, Craigslist was actually available throughout the entire US and is now available throughout the entire world. By 2008, the newspaper industry as a whole had lost $5 billion in classified ad revenue. And this was like a 70% drop in less than a decade. So, as you can imagine, this is pretty huge. And you can think about it this way, that there was one website that didn't have any reporters, and it didn't have a printing press, and it didn't have any editors, and it basically destroyed the economic engine that had sustained journalism for more than a century. And this was a big problem, a big shakeup to the financial model of news, which had been supported by advertising. And I guess I would kind of argue that news has continued to not adjust well to the pressures of new technology. So what happened at that time is still going on today. Now, once this happened, the actual money from advertising, and in particular the money from local advertising, because we're talking about local journalism, became a problem. And so you saw this real wave of consolidation. You saw big chains buying out small publications or buying out small TV stations. And then they started buying each other out. And today, there are 6 companies that own half of all the US daily newspapers. And there's also a small number of companies that own large numbers of broadcast stations, companies like Cox and Sinclair, and companies like Gannett on the paper side. And you saw that in some cases, newspapers were getting bought out by private equity companies, by hedge funds, those kinds of things. So think about it for a second. If you have a hedge fund from out of town that comes in and buys your local newspaper, why would they do that? Their goal is to make as much money as possible. And usually to make money, you're going to cut expenses and you're going to raise revenues. So they would want to A, sell as many ads as they can, and B, sell as many subscriptions as they can, and C, pay as few people as they can, because people are often the expensive part in journalism. So the quality was definitely going down. And as that happened, the ability of local journalism to actually hold that local power to account was decreasing by a lot because they just didn't have the people to do it anymore. There have been huge numbers of journalists fired. In the town where I work, there is still a newspaper, and that newspaper kind of has 1.5 staff people left for a whole county. It's for the whole publication. It's really just a bunch of ads, and then it's stuff that's reported in other places. I do an exercise with my students, and you can Google for today's front pages, and you will get something from a nonprofit called the Freedom Forum. And they have actual front pages from publications all over the world that you can look at. Take a look at the ones in the United States, and you'll find that because of consolidation and corporate ownership, you will find the exact same front page on publications from wildly different locations because it's all being created in one central location. So you might have, a newspaper in Alabama and a newspaper in Tennessee, and they have the same stories, the same pictures, the same layout, all of that. They're not local stories. They're national stories or international stories. The only thing that's different is the name of the place on the top. So the actual amount of news that's available in local news outlets has shrunk quite a bit. You'll also see this in broadcasting, when you'll see network-based stories showing up on multiple stations across different markets. Sort of turning to the media as an investment and gutting it to make a lot of money has really impacted this sort of watchdog ownership of journalism. And we've seen something kind of wild happen, because as the newsrooms shrank, local newspapers died, local TV stations consolidated under smaller ownership, and then the rich people came back. And this time they were just buying what was left. And you can see this, right? You can see Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post. You can see Rupert Murdoch building a global empire out of the Wall Street Journal and Fox News and The Sun. And it might look like it's philanthropy, but lately it's looked a lot more like it's influence. But in any case, it's really not the people's press anymore, right? It's not bringing up the issues of everyday people or holding power to account. But it's more like a megaphone for billionaires. So when we say, that the media, and particularly when we're talking about local media, we need to be clear. The funding model has changed. The power structure has changed, and public service has really gotten pushed out by investment instead. We've talked about money, and I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we're going to talk about what we've lost because of the loss of the money. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Let's keep talking about what happens when local news goes away. Since 2005, almost 3,000 newspapers have shut down in the US, and that's about a third of all of them disappearing over 20 years. And when they vanish, they are often replaced by something worse, a news desert. There are communities where there is no original local reporting. I used to live in a news desert in a small community in central Texas. We didn't have local media, but we still had local government. So we had a city council and we had a school board. And when people ran for these positions, the way that you found out who was running was literally hand painted plywood signs. People would spray paint names on them with stencils and stick them in an empty field, and it would say, "Vote for these 5 people," and give their names. There was nothing about what they believed, their experience, their qualifications. There was none of that. This is the kind of information that's normally the purview of journalism, and it just didn't exist because that's what it's like to live in a news desert. And as of 2023, about half of US counties, more than 1,500 of them, either have just one local news outlet with no competition or they have nothing at all. Older and poorer counties, which is often where watchdog journalism is the most needed, tend to be the ones with no coverage. So think about that. No one is reporting on city council meetings. No one is at the school board when the budget gets cut. No one's asking why the water smells like methane or where that drug funding treatment went. When scrutiny disappears, corruption tends to go up, and community engagement tends to go down. And in fact, studies have shown that people who don't have local news are less likely to vote, and their politics often become more polarized. But there's even a bigger picture kind of thing. We're not just losing news, we're losing that shared understanding that helps define what a community is. Remember, in a democracy, we depend on having a shared understanding of reality, and that's how we all decide what leaders to vote for. Without news, we lose that. Okay, now let's talk about platforms. And I don't mean newspapers or television, I mean the places where people actually get their news today. More than 80% of people in the US get at least some of their news from digital platforms, and that number is even higher for younger audiences. But on those platforms, editors don't decide what you see, algorithms do. So the order of stories in a newscast or the layout of a front page, these are curated by people thinking about what matters to the audience and what matters to the truth. But your feed on social media is curated by what's going to make you click. Because social media platforms are businesses. They make money by keeping people on the platform so that they can sell more ads. So you think you're getting a free service, but really you're the product. Your attention is what's being sold. So we used to call it the press because journalists literally ran the printing press and they controlled the pipeline of news. But now that power belongs to TikTok and X and YouTube and Facebook. These companies don't assign reporters. They don't have to check facts. They don't have ethics guidelines. They're driven by engagement and ad revenue. And what gets that engagement? Outrage, emotion, division. And this is why a deeply reported piece from ProPublica will show up under a conspiracy theory about microchips and vaccines. And local investigative reporting doesn't stand a chance in a global platform that's optimized for virality. We've outsourced the gatekeeping of information to companies whose goal isn't the truth, it's profit. So journalists, where they still exist, can report stories. But now they're dependent on the algorithm to deliver those stories to the audience. And if an algorithm doesn't favor it, the story disappears, no matter how good or important it is. And so this brings us to another factor in platforms, which is partisan media. Platforms are optimizing for engagement, and nobody does engagement like ideological content. So Fox News and MSNBC and The Daily Wire and The Young Turks, each one builds large engaged audiences by blending commentary with selective facts. And so this isn't necessarily fake news, but it's more like strategic framing. And platforms do reward it. Hyperpartisan sources are more than twice as likely to go viral as mainstream outlets. And outrage spreads faster than nuance. Algorithms, they don't care about accuracy, they care about speed. So we end up with what researchers have called epistemic closure. It's a closed loop of partisan content where users get more of what they already believe and less of what might challenge them. You can think of it this way. We don't have a shared media space anymore. We have parallel realities, each with its own feed, each with its own fears, and each with its own facts. All right, now let's talk about us, the audience. Journalism's collapse isn't just about money or tech or platforms, it's also about us and our habits. At one time, we had what we used to call appointment news. So, for example, a newscast came on at 6 o'clock and most people watched it. Or the newspaper showed up on your doorstep in the morning and you read it over breakfast. You, as the audience, were showing up on the journalist's terms. But today it's different. News is ambient. It's background noise. It's a headline that you scroll past while you're folding laundry or a podcast you half hear in traffic. Most people don't even click through. In fact, a Reuters study recently found that 65% of Americans often or sometimes just read the headline. We're multitasking, we're overwhelmed, we're just tired. News fatigue is real. More than 40% of Americans say they actively avoid the news, especially if it's depressing or divisive. So we want to be informed, but we don't want to be miserable. So we become headline skimmers and doom scrollers. And that shift from paying attention to just being exposed hurts our ability to understand, because journalism isn't just something you consume, it's a practice of paying attention. And now we can layer in misinformation. We've gutted funding, we've handed distribution to platforms, we've trained the audiences to scroll, and this is a perfect environment for lies. And most information isn't spread by bots, it's spread by real people, because it confirms what we already believe. I've talked before about confirmation bias, right? So we trust what matches our views. There's also availability bias. We believe what we see more often is more true. Algorithms amplify popular ideas, and that makes those falsehoods feel familiar. And the most dangerous misinformation isn't totally fake, it's half true. It's alternative facts, it's emotionally charged. And when journalists don't control the megaphone and the audience rewards speed over substance, lies just scale faster than facts. And even when misinformation is debunked, the correction rarely catches up. And that's what we call the continued influence effect. Once a false idea takes root, it's hard to shake. So if you think about it, we're in a media system where the truth just kind of has to fight uphill. And finally, let's talk about AI. We've already created a perfect storm for misinformation, and now we're adding something that can write, illustrate, translate, and publish news in seconds. And it's already being used in more newsrooms than you might think. It can improve efficiency, but it can fail in accuracy. And if there's no human checking it, that's a big problem. Because AI-generated content is fast and cheap. And in underfunded and understaffed local newsrooms, that's tempting. There are ethical landmines, though. What if an AI-generated story defames someone? Who's responsible? If the training data is biased and the results are biased, who catches that? And then when the AI becomes good enough, if you're being owned by someone who's just milking you for profit, who's going to lose their job? So these small local newsrooms often don't have the people to verify AI content or catch deepfakes. So when the next misinformation comes, it may come from inside the newsroom. These systems are getting faster and harder to detect. And even OpenAI shut down their own detection tool because it wasn't reliable. So, is AI going to save journalism? Is it going to make journalism more profitable and less accurate? Or is it just going to speed up its replacement? So we've covered a lot. We've covered vanishing money, platforms that rewrote the rules, audiences drifting away, a flood of misinformation, and machines writing the headlines. But even with all of that, I think it's good to know that there are still local journalists out there doing the work. They're sitting through 6-hour city council meetings, they're knocking on doors after storms, they're filing public records requests. Oftentimes, they're not working for legacy local news outlets. They may be working for new outlets that are being sprung up and being nonprofit funded, for example, or crowdfunded even in some cases. But, they can't do it alone. Journalism is a public service, but that only works if the public shows up. So you can think about what you can do. If you can, buy a subscription to your local news outlet. Even if there's not that much news in it anymore, anything that helps to make a paycheck for a local journalist is probably going to benefit you. Subscriptions also make great gifts, especially for older family members who already have too much stuff. When you share stories, make a point of sharing stories that are fact-checked and fair. That helps to put good info into other people's feeds, and your sharing of it provides that social proof that makes it more likely that they'll believe it and share it too. And then talk to your friends about where they get their news and why they trust it. None of that takes a newsroom, it just takes you. The future of journalism doesn't have to belong to tech companies, billionaires, or bots. It can still belong to all of us if we wanted to. Thanks for listening this week, and stay sharp, everyone. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.